Hello, good morning, everyone. So, my name is Ashley Brown Greer. I will be moderating this panel today. I am sorry for the technical difficulties. The MacBook is like, girl, you cannot be on camera today, even though I got camera ready. But it's okay. My panelists and I prepared for this the other day. So, I am a part of the We Represent team. I am currently a PhD student at Howard University in the Higher Education Leadership and Policy Studies program. I'm also the founder of Fulbright HBCU, as well as what's plastered on this screen right now, International HBCU Exchange. So we look forward to talking with our panelists today, and I will read their lovely bios. Okay, so first off, Jeremy Gombin Sperling is the Diversity and Inclusion Liaison for the Fulbright Americas program. In addition to his work in Fulbright, Jeremy is a PhD candidate in the International Education Policy Program at the University of Maryland, College Park. His research and teaching focuses on reshaping student learning on international educational experiences through the integration of pedagogies informed by social justice theory and praxis. He holds an MA in International Education Policy from University of Maryland, College Park, and a BA in Religious Studies and Psychology from New York University. Next, Dr. Kelly Swayze is the Diversity and Inclusion Liaison for the Fulbright Program in East Asia and the Pacific. Her academic background is in anthropology with a focus on identity in the public sphere, representation, and the media, and the rights of minority communities in Southeast Asia. She has served as a faculty member in a multidisciplinary graduate program focused on public advocacy for diversity and social justice initiatives, and designed numerous programs for students and educators on Southeast Asia diversities in Indonesia, where she has resided since 2010. Next, Natalie Spencer joined the official CLS, or Critical Language Scholar team, in 2016 as the program officer for Alumni Affairs, working to design and implement programming for a vibrant community of over 5,000 CLS alumni. Natalie now serves as the CLS program's Senior Outreach and Selection Officer. In this role, she works with faculty, staff, and administrators at colleges and universities across the country to promote the CLS program and support student applicants. Natalie also facilitates the participant selection process, working with readers and evaluators from over 200 institutions each year to select a bright and diverse group of citizen ambassadors to send abroad. Natalie earned her MA in International Education Management at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, California, and holds a dual BA in Mass Communication and French from the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. She has studied and taught in France and maintains a passion for cultural exchange and the value of the study abroad experience. And last but not least, Bailey Kepford is the Chicago-based University Relations Manager at ICEP Study Abroad for the U.S. Northeast and Midwest and Sub-Saharan Africa, and serves as the primary contact for member institutions in the region. She works closely with ICEP member institutions to promote mobility, develop new programs, facilitate strategic initiatives, manage exchange numbers, and uphold membership standards. Bailey obtained her BA in Global Studies and Religious Studies from Missouri State University. At MSU, she participated in an ICEP program at the University de Savoie in France, which kickstarted her passion for international education. Bailey comes from a background in nonprofit coordination and has spent 3 years working at ICEP in her capacity as URM. At ICEP, she is a member of the Diversity and Inclusion Task Force and has developed and compiled resources for underrepresented students to aid them in overcoming any barriers that they face to study abroad. So we have a great team today, a great panel. And what I failed to mention about myself is I was a Fulbright English teaching assistant to Malaysia in 2016-17. And with that, we will start with our first question. I'll give an overview. So the overview of this panel: what resources exist already to help support underrepresented students abroad? Learn from different international exchange programs, officials who will talk about the work they do and how to connect underrepresented grantees with the tools and resources necessary for their well-being. And our learning outcomes. So you all will learn of initiatives implemented by different international exchange programs to ensure that awardees are supported while abroad. And with that, we will finally start our first question. What is your biggest piece of advice for getting started with DEI? And again, that could be within your career, or you can also add some personal elements to that.
I'm happy to start off just with a little bit more. So, hi everyone, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Ashley, so much for facilitating this panel. To everyone for getting We Represent together. This is exciting to be here. So biggest piece of advice that I'm going to say with getting started with DEI work is what I'm going to label as like specificity. And what I mean by that is like, more and more we're hearing the term DEI, right? We break it down to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think what I've had to learn in sort of my getting into this field, into this work more, is being really clear about what we're actually going after. Because each of those words are connected, but they also represent different sorts of things, initiatives, and actions. So I think for me, like, when I think about diversity, I'm thinking very much along the lines of representation, and we all need to honor that representation very much matters. Inclusion to me speaks more to sort of like how we're also able to continue to support folks who have been historically excluded from different programs and are facing different kinds of structural barriers throughout their programs in order to ensure that they have resources that are needed, and also, have community as well too. Where when I think about equity, I'm thinking structurally, right? So if we're thinking equity, that to me means sort of trying to find ways to change the structures, whether it's study abroad or other international exchange programs, to therefore ensure that, there's sort of a more equal footing to allow folks who have been historically excluded to be able to enter into programs. So I just wanted to kind of set that up because I think that's something that I'm also still learning as well too. And I think it's important because sometimes we may use the term I may use the term DEI when talking about an initiative and suddenly realize, I'm just talking about a diversity initiative. And so I think language really, and as we'll talk about, like super matters. And I think the next thing when I say about specificity is just thinking about like, what communities and folks are we trying to support, and are we represented ourselves with our own identities in that community, right? So if I'm working on, or if I'm part of, for example, working with an initiative to support folks with disabilities, I identify as an able-bodied person. So that means that there's learning that I need to make sure that I'm doing to be able to sort of be part of that conversation. But also I think being able to be specific about the communities we're trying to support allows us to better shape our initiatives as well too, in terms of how we want to support folks, who needs to be at the table in terms of conversations, and how we go about it. I'm just going to throw that out there as sort of my little spiel. And also I think just work I'm continuing to try and do.
I'll just jump in. I agree with Jeremy, especially in terms of that level of specificity, and that words and representation matter. I would say that the biggest hurdle that I see when I talk about these topics with other colleagues is that people are holding themselves back because they think there's one answer or one resource or a right answer. And it's not that kind of work. There isn't one workbook that you can give to students and they're going to feel prepared when they go abroad. It is ongoing. It's iterative. It's not solution oriented. There's no one resource. There's no one answer. You just have to be open to learning, open to evolving, open to making mistakes and learning from that. Especially because none of us embody every identity. And so we're going into things that we're uncomfortable with and that we might not understand. So you have to kind of embrace that discomfort, be okay with learning in that space. It's like really reflective work, but as long as you approach it with empathy and the ability to learn and change and grow as you're doing this kind of work, you just have to step into it. You can't be afraid. You can't be held back because you think you don't know the perfect answer, because there is no perfect answer. So that is kind of my general advice.
I can jump in. Ditto to everything Jeremy and Natalie said. One thing I'll add too is so first, I don't think I explained what ISEP study abroad was in my bio, so I'll just kind of explain what it is, because I'm sure folks may not have heard of us, but we work with facilitating exchanges between countries all over the world. So not just US to international, but we exchange students between countries around the world. So one thing that I've found that has helped me kind of kickstart my involvement in DEI at ISEP is just kind of listening to my folks at my member institutions that I work with and students, and about their needs, and kind of really being open to what are the resources that people are asking for. And it might come to the DEI area through sort of a way that you don't expect. So for instance, I started getting some questions about we have all these commuter students and they don't know what questions to ask and what resources to use. And I started doing some digging into that and realized that, for one semester, 64% of our commuter students were, either LGBTQ plus, or they were a minority in some sense. And so I started doing some research into that and just being like, okay, this is something that we really need to develop resources for. It's not something that I had thought about needing resources for, but just kind of listening and seeing where are these areas that we need to work on, that we're hearing from either students or from people in the field or whatever, that need to kind of be dug into deeper and looked into more. So that'd be my advice.
Yeah, I think just building on what everyone has said, I come from an academic background in which I've been thinking about these questions for a long time about identity, equity, and inclusion. And for me, when we use these terms, diversity, equity, inclusion, for me, it's sort of an ethical orientation. It is not limited actually to our professional lives. It's something that we are doing because we want better publics, we want better societies. And so it's not just limited to what we do in a sort of professional sense, but in fact is something that we have to start doing self-reflection on. So I take some lessons from my training in anthropology about reflexivity and positionality, about thinking about myself in relation to how my identity is constructed, and also how identities are constructed in different places, and try and sort of put that into play in what I'm doing in a professional sense. But I think that anyone that gets involved in this field really feels a sense of, we are moving globally towards this idea that we have to have a better situation, a more inclusive situation for our general publics in our nation states, in our international situations, in educational exchange. And so I think really it starts with ourselves, kind of having this self-reflection, and then going into a sense of how do we apply that both in our personal and professional lives. And I think that many of us get attracted to this field. As you guys have said, there is no expert in DEI, actually. We're all kind of struggling with this together and trying to find answers. So it's not about anybody having the right answers, but it's about going through this sort of process of self-evaluation on a regular basis and trying to give other people the tools to do that themselves as well.
Thank you all so much. So we will go to our next question. What successful initiatives or best practices has your organization identified concerning diversity and inclusion issues?
I can start on this one. There's a lot. That's a a big question, but I think I'll focus on, because I do outreach, recruitment, selection for the CLS program. I can speak more readily about those things, although there's tons that goes into on-program support. And I do want to emphasize that outreach, recruitment, selection, just the very beginning of that. And if you don't have systems to support students once they're on the program, all of that work is meaningless. But in the time that American Councils has hosted the CLS program and done recruitment and outreach, and that started in 2012, we had about 25% of students on the program identifying as students of color. This summer, in the past 3-4 summers, we've had over 40% of our students identifying as students of color. So those kinds of outcomes we really see as evidence that our work is good, but I'm still hesitant to call anything a best practice. So just things that we've done that we feel are in the right direction. We've done a lot of work on making the application process more accessible. I think it starts that early. It starts with outreach as well, but the application process, I think, can create a lot of barriers for students. And so thinking about aligning the application questions and making them very direct and asking questions about things that really matter, rather than asking questions and designing a rubric around things like prestige markers. We've done things like this past summer, we removed one of the letters of recommendation that was required. We went down to one letter of recommendation just because students were off campus for COVID. I know later we might talk a little bit about COVID implications, but removing letters of recommendation, going down to one, making that one letter of recommendation, we actually have recommenders type it into a form so that they can't attach something on fancy letterhead that's going to distract reviewers by looking at the prestige of the institution or the prestige of the person providing the recommendation. We really want it to be about the qualities of the student. And making sure that we're looking at things like that. We've removed the number of awards and extracurricular activities that students can list on their application. We've limited it to 5 so that students really have to pare it down, and that students that have had ample time and privilege to do lots of extracurricular activities aren't given additional space to enumerate those. And so that, someone who's been working part-time jobs or doing different types of volunteer work have just as much opportunity to make those opportunities shine through the application. So just little things like that with the application process, I think, have made a big difference. Really broad outreach. Again, this is like a huge question, so I could talk for an hour about this, and I won't. The one other little thing that I will mention that our team has started doing recently that I think has made a big difference, that is like really easy thing for any office or team to start doing, is monthly we meet as a team of 15 to talk through diversity, equity, and inclusion in everything that we do. And we align it with our program calendar. So, in the spring, when we're working on preparation materials for students, when we're working on the new draft of our handbook, we will focus that meeting on the handbook, and we'll talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in our student handbooks. We'll review those sections. We'll have a conversation as a team with everyone, whether they work on that handbook or not, to review those materials and talk through those issues. When we go through selection panels, we'll have a meeting about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's not about the logistics of the events or anything like that. It is a focused meeting to talk through how diversity, equity, and inclusion can be improved and more intricately woven through everything that we do. So that's a more recent initiative that we started on the CLS team that I think is easily replicable for other programs.
Okay, does anyone else want to answer the question?
I can go.
Okay.
Yeah, so like Natalie said, this is a pretty big question. And I kind of broke it into 2 areas in my mind, is like the internal kind of better practices that we at ISEP try to do with the staff. So like, for instance, we have our DEI task force works on a monthly newsletter where we really put some time and effort into researching a specific DEI topic. We provide resources to the staff, further learning opportunities, and then we also work on developing an external resource to utilize for those. So that's something that has been really successful because it helps us all kind of continue the learning process internally at ICEP. And then when you're kind of in charge of the newsletter and working on it with one other person, so it's kind of like a two-person team, you're really delving into a topic and learning and getting to share that knowledge with the whole team. So that's been something that's been really successful for us. As well as we do these like Brave Spaces meetings where we kind of talk about how we can better serve students, how we can better serve staff and our members. And we just kind of have these little groups where you can feel free to like share your ideas or your questions and kind of learn from each other in a group setting. So those are a couple of things that we have implemented. We're currently working on trying to make our trainings better. So like doing occasional like training sessions, and when we onboard new folks, like really having a strong focus on DEI topics and providing a training just about that alone, and how that ties in with our mission as an organization and the initiatives we're working on, because that's something that we really want folks to understand right off the bat and not just like learn as they go kind of. So that's sort of something that we've been working on implementing. And then externally, we definitely have a lot of resources that we've used. And one thing is we really love helping students share their story to other students, because in my personal experience, that's really how students feel comfortable understanding certain topics and feel comfortable sharing. So we've facilitated some different things, like we have a podcast that we have students share about their experience if they're willing to. We did that with one alumni for Black History Month who shared about their experience. We had another student who wrote a blog post about studying abroad with a hearing disorder, and just sharing about their experience with that. So just allowing students to share their experience with other students, and then that really helps students like learn more and understand what to expect from their abroad experience. So that's been really successful for us as well. So yeah, that's what I have to share on that topic.
I'll just share really briefly, and I think also just to kind of shape a little bit more about like Kelly and my position. So both of us are diversity inclusion liaisons, and we operate within two different regions within the Fulbright program, which is divided worldwide based in State Department regions. So I work in Fulbright Americas, which is for the Fulbright Western Hemisphere. So working with countries within the Americas and the Caribbean, as a way of sort of trying to strengthen institutional capacity around areas of diversity inclusion through different forms of initiatives and other trainings, orientations, work of that matter. One thing I think I wanted to highlight, I mean, in some ways, Fulbright working towards these positions has been a successful initiative in certain ways. The fact that there's actually now attention and energy going to hopefully funding even more regions to have positions, because currently of the 6 Fulbright regions, there are 3 that have a regional diversity inclusion liaison or coordinator. And the 3 of us in particular, so that's me here in Western Hemisphere, Kelly with East Asia Pacific, and then our colleague Susanna, who's in Europe and Eurasia. I think one of the things, especially during the year of COVID, that has been important and kind of works off what Bailey was sharing was the 3 of us have just tried to find ways to create different sorts of global initiatives as a way to sort of amplify Fulbright grantee voices. So through that, we created this podcast called Fulbright Forward, where we feature Fulbright alum, as well as other sorts of specialists around issues of diversity inclusion within both the kind of higher education sphere, but also more about just different forms of social issues that pertain to our regions or in a kind of global context. As well as we started a panel series called Unmasking Inequalities. That was another way of just being able for us to come together, have panelists from across the world, find time zones that work, to be able to have these conversations, in particular for those themes as to how COVID-19 has impacted different marginalized, minoritized communities globally. So that for us has been, I think, a really powerful way of doing that. I just want to add with the global piece as well, too, being able to also have more of those deeper nuanced conversations of how these issues of inclusion and marginalization show up in different regional and also country-specific contexts, which I think has also been like helpful learning for ourselves in our work. And we hope also for our audience who has been able to be part of those initiatives.
Okay. Thank you all for that, answering that question. So our next question, what resources are available to students that are abroad?
Kelly, you go ahead.
I just want to sort of piggyback on what Jeremy said. So Jeremy, Susanna, and I's positions are very much not in the side of the US recruiting side, but actually once students get into the field abroad. And I think that our positions, again, are something that have been created to support this idea that we are here as resources for students from diverse backgrounds as they go into a cross-cultural and an intercultural situation. So our roles in themselves, I think, are some sort of support from the Fulbright program to help students. And I do want to say that there has been great strides made in diversifying the applicant pool coming into Fulbright, but that's only a quarter of the job that we have to do, because once the applicant pool is diversified, what has to happen is we have to change the rest of the life cycle of the program to be sort of sensitive to these issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, we've made a lot of efforts to work with our regional partners to help support the idea that they should also be educated in all of these issues as well from an American perspective, because of course they are coming at it from their own perspectives regionally. So we're in this position of sort of mediating between what are the American diversity categories, and then also there are diversity categories that people are coming into in the regions that we work. So we are doing things like training staff to understand a bit more about DE&I from an American perspective, but also working with orientation. And I think that's been a really important point of focus for all of us, to think about how we recognize that the experience for students who are coming from the United States into different regions around the world is going to be different based on their identity, and that colorism and racism exists in different societies. And we need to be very straightforward about that and talking about that in orientation sessions. Also talking about the reality of white privilege and Western privilege in international education and exchange. So trying to start from this sort of position of being very straightforward and honest that these things exist, and how can we create networks and support systems for our diverse students who are coming into these programs, who may have very different experiences than a white student coming from the United States coming into our programs. So these are some of the practices that we have been developing, both as mediators between both sides, but also working with our regional partners as we've been going forward.
Yeah, a lot of what you say, Kelly, really resonates with me. And we both work on Department of State, Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs funded programs. And so it's not surprising that a lot of the Fulbright initiatives, kind of mirror what we're doing on a smaller program like the Critical Language Scholarship Program. But I really appreciate what you say about networks and support systems, because I really think when we talk about resources and what resources students have abroad, like that human resource, that need for community, that need for a support network is like the number one resource that we can work to build. We can work to build empathic communities for our students overseas. We can work with those institutional partners, with those hosts. We have the CLS program is a cohort program. So you're going overseas with other students. We can work through orientation programs to kind of prepare the whole cohort to be a supportive unit for one another. And then we send students overseas with a resident director, which Kelly has served in that role for the CLS program. So she knows about that, but we send somebody who is like the point person to kind of take care of our students. And we do extensive diversity and inclusion training with those resident directors. We do mental health first aid training with those resident directors. But you can't build empathy in a person. I mean, you can try to build empathy in a person and you can educate them and you can do trainings. But a lot of it comes down to the people that you're hiring and the people that you're selecting for these types of programs. So we do our best to just build support networks. I really think that having a support network, having people around you who are prepared to help you navigate some of those difficult challenges is something that cannot be replicated by a handbook or a video or an alumni panel, although those things we do and are important. I think building community is a big part of it. One tangible resource that we have as a program is our alumni resource directories. So we do try to put our participants in contact with alumni. We send out a big survey. We ask students to upload a photo and then to literally check boxes of which of these challenges, which of these identities are you willing to talk with students about? So being LGBTQ abroad, are you willing to talk to students about that? Are you willing to talk to students about being a person of color abroad? And we have them fill all of that out, and then we distribute those directories to our students directly so that they can kind of have some unmediated conversation and just be in touch with each other as an additional support network while they're overseas. So that's one physical thing that we've done. I know Fulbright has really great communities. They have Fulbright Noir, Fulbright HBCU, Fulbright Salam, all of these great communities that they've built. So I think that just also emphasizes, and they're alumni led also, it just emphasizes the importance of having community, having contact with people who can really build that empathic and safe space for you while you're overseas. And that can't be replicated by any singular resource.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head with that, Natalie. I had that in my notes to talk about too, because I think it's so important. So yeah, really the only thing to add, I guess, is just that I think it's important to have a variety of different types of resources available where students can have something where they can, read a country handbook to understand it. That might be their preferred way to get the information they need. Maybe they're a student that wants to study abroad in the Middle East and they're LGBTQ plus and they are, nervous about it. So providing resources in a handbook, talking about identities in an orientation. And then like Natalie said, I think it's so powerful to connect students with alumni that have gone through similar things and already done the research, just kind of diversifying the types of interactions that students can have with your resources. So whether it's written or, it's an audio experience like a podcast, or it's connecting actually one-on-one with someone or in a group setting, just providing a good variety of different types of resources is so important because students have different ways that they want to experience the information and receive that information. And it's such important information for them to have. So just having a diversity of different types of resources is super important.
I'll just add real quick that I think all these things together, I think create this beautiful foundation for folks going abroad. One other place that I just wanted to kind of highlight, which is also local organizations and community groups in the host country. So I've seen in my region that different commissions and embassies have partnered with organizations who are working on, and really helping also grantees get in contact with and understand more of even just the current situation around issues, whether it's around issues related to social struggle. So I think helping also students connect to organizations, for example, if they are a queer student and being connected to or learning more about what LGBTQ organizations look like, for example, in a host country, or issues that are, or in different organizations that are trying to combat, whether it be racism, ableism, or other forms of oppression that are occurring in that space, is also quite helpful because it also provides a connection to an organization where a person may be able to find community and also better maybe get insight into the context of that situation or that sort of social issue within the country that they're going to as well. So I just kind of wanted to highlight that as another thing that I'm seeing different partners doing in this moment, and another way that I feel like we're able to help our students really connect on the ground with folks that they may also identify with too in terms of navigating their identity abroad.
Yeah, and I think I would just add that adds a very important element to when we're talking about DE&I in terms of how we are understanding those terms, right? So, there is the understanding of diversity, equity, inclusion that comes from the United States, but then when you're going into these regions, the understanding of what diversity is looks very different around the world. And so I think this idea that we should be sort of aligning ourselves or using the expertise of local communities is very important, in that, you know, Jeremy and I, for instance, don't become the spokespersons for the regions that we're in, but in fact, we are trying to connect students that are coming with people who are working actively in these fields and can explain what the real situation is in the context in which people are going into. And I think that's a really important way of elevating and really highlighting these voices, which is part of DE&I work. And so I think that really has to become part of the integrated process that we use when we're talking about educational exchange. It's not just people from the United States explaining what's going on in other countries, but in fact that we are working with partners on the ground in order to really help introduce our participants to what is really happening from a very grounded perspective.
And I think this may have been mentioned, but I know, and I've only been a part of Fulbright, right? But I know that we actually had a meeting with Fulbright and the State Department last summer, and they were very open to hearing the suggestions from the Fulbright alumni ambassadors. And also, Fulbright alumni ambassadors, we really share a lot of information with students who are interested in applying for the program. And I talked with a lot of Black people who are interested in either research or ETA. And it's a real conversation, right? Like, I'm not going to make them afraid to apply or go abroad, but there are just certain things that they have to know before, embarking on such a journey. And I think that is really helpful for potential applicants. And going to the next question. Oh, and Natalie mentioned this earlier about the Fulbright affinity groups, which again are a really great resource. I am the founder of Fulbright HBCU, and Vanessa Diaz is the co-founder of Fulbright Latinx. And there's so many that are on, and we're all on social media. So definitely reach out to us. The next question. How do you stay up to date with changing DEI terminology and best practices? And this is a two-part question. So the second part, as it relates to international exchange context, how do you involve host countries in identifying best practices?
I mean, I think Kelly and Jeremy have spoken to this and probably have more to say, especially in regards to preparing host countries, because that is such a central part of what you all are doing. For me as an individual, in terms of staying up to date with changing terminology, I mean, it's just a whole lot of reading, listening, following accounts on social media. I mean, a lot of people are just doing this work all day, every day. And so being open to that, joining professional organizations, going to conferences, listening to your colleagues. I've said it, this will be the third time I've said it, but it was in our practice sessions that part of the joy of being on a panel like this for me is learning from my colleagues and hearing other people speak the language and talk about the initiatives that they're involved in. So just being involved and leaning into all of that and not being afraid. It is, and Kelly alluded to this, it is personal work. I don't just learn this terminology and keep up with changing DEI during my day job, it takes being interested and reading books that are related to the topic outside work hours and consuming that kind of media. So, but yeah, really basic stuff in terms of keeping up. And then for involving host countries, as a Department of State funded program, we're in a really unique position that we bring all of our international partners, our institute directors, to Washington, D.C. in a normal year. Last year, it was a big virtual meeting, but in a normal year, we bring them all, we meet in person all at once and are able to engage in these kinds of conversations. We give them kind of that variety of format. We give them written material that goes through definitions, that talks through case studies, and we do a session where we're talking about the diversity of the students on our program and how we approach that. It is challenging to bring them all together to do that because there are a lot of different cultures and viewpoints and opinions in that room. We work in 24, 25 different cities around the world. So it's a challenge, but we do see it as a huge opportunity that we get them all in one room at one time to talk through these issues. And then it has to be ongoing work. How is it written into our partnership agreements, these topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion? How is it written into our requirements for teacher training of the teachers that are teaching CLS institutes overseas? We have kind of like a big, long checklist inventory to see, like, are we integrating it into these parts of our partnerships? Are we speaking with our partners on these topics? So it's it's a big project and it's an ongoing thing. And again, it's evolving all of the time. The other thing that I think we've done that has been effective is connecting our institute partners again with alumni. It's sad that we rely on our alumni so much because you all do so much, but you really are like the most effective at communicating. And we can talk to our international partners all day about what issues students might face while they're abroad, but putting an alumnus or an alumna in front of them to say, like, here is what I saw in your community and this was my experience, just speaks much louder to them because they already care. They care so much about our students. They really do. And so putting that experience in front of them and making it real has been effective in providing that space for teaching and learning and growth among our international partners.
Oh, go ahead, Jeremy. Okay. So yeah, I think, everything that Natalie said is important, reading articles, books, attending conferences. Also, at ISEP, we utilize some of the resources from our member institutions as well, because, sometimes you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Someone else is kind of collecting information on a specific topic, and you can kind of, utilize that to stay up to date on some of the best practices or terminology, things like that. So that's been helpful. Also, something that's been really helpful for me personally is joining like different working groups. So like I'm on a forum working group right now that's looking at best practices from HBCUs, TCUs, HSIs. What am I missing? There's a lot of acronyms in our working group title. But just in general, MSIs, collecting best practices from them, which has been really helpful for, yes, thank you, Ashley. HSIs, ANNAPSIS.
Anapezes.
Anapezes. All the acronyms. It's like alphabet soup sometimes, but that has been super helpful to connect with others in the field from kind of a variety of different, their universities or program providers. And then we have one of our resident directors who's on our DEI task force, who is on a forum working group that's working to compile definitions of concepts of equity, diversity, inclusion from different cultural contexts and perspectives, which has been super interesting, which I think ties into the second part of this question, which is like, how do you involve host countries? We, have different folks that provide kind of their perspectives through our DEI task force initiatives, through, resources that they share, through conversations that we have as a community. So we do, like ISEP coffee hours, for instance, where we connect with all of everyone from all over the world. We kind of just have a discussion about relevant topics, some of them involving DEI, some of them not, where we can all just like ask questions of each other, share resources, share best practices, things like that. So that's been really successful. I feel like I'm missing something. We also do like in-depth panels where we kind of ask someone from one of our, host universities, or, just from different variety of backgrounds to share on like a panel kind of like this about their perspectives on different topics. And I think that covers everything I wanted to say in terms of that question. So Jeremy, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I wanted just to start off with is just around like also I guess for me, like learning the principle of like talking about the evolution of vocabulary, right? Because I think I think we all see this as part of our roles and part of the work that we need to do both as people and professionals, number one. But number two, I've been in situations also where I've heard folks who have been like, oh, there's just so many new terms that are coming up. And I think what's really important for us to remember is that vocab is always evolving. And especially for communities that are either historically excluded or face certain forms of marginalization, like finding terminology is also about finding political stands, finding a term that brings us together as a community. Like I think about that like as a queer person who used to only use the word gay, but now is like loving the word queer, because I feel like that represents me and also like where I'm coming from a political, also like a political perspective too. So I think that's something that's important to like, if folks are ever experiencing people that maybe have these sort of feelings or thoughts of like, oh, but I can't always learn these new things. Well, it's like, well, think back 20 years in your life about words that were once used that may not be anymore, or even how you define yourself. I feel like that just sometimes has been a helpful way of just even shaping the conversation. Regarding DE&I work specifically in vocab, one of the things actually has been very helpful, I think, and Kelly and I have both done this in our regions, is that we have started regional councils. And so we've invited folks from across our different, so again, working in the Fulbright world, working with ECA, cooperating agencies, like just American councils, for example, but for us, it's international education and LASPAO, the Fulbright commissions and post, to have a council where we meet at least every 6 to 8 weeks to sort of begin to like build community and talk about DEI issues. So that for us, that for me, I think for Kelly too, has been a really powerful way of having some of these conversations, because it lets folks on the council ask us, for example, questions about vocab or questions about, so I want to do more work with this community from the US. What do I do? How do I say that? But also allows us to ask them certain questions as well too. So like I'll give a very brief example of, for example, back to the LGBTQ sphere. So in parts of Latin America, for example, Brazil, Peru, like the term travesti is a term that represents like a sense of solidarity and community for trans folks, and specifically trans women, like in those regions. Where its translation in the US, it really refers more to a derogatory word that we don't really hear much anymore. Not to say that someone might not use it, but it's just to say that I think that has been a sphere, again, to go back to this whole idea of sort of this different kind of regional understanding about how vocab evolves and is used. But I think also, again, about thinking about how this vocabulary, often in a DEI context, when talking about communities that may face marginalization or historic exclusion from international ed programs, are often terms that become a way of like defining one's community. So I think just remembering that this language does really matter, and that it is our responsibility to sort of do that work to learn. And I think what we've also shared, and Natalie, I appreciate you sharing in the beginning, like if we make a mistake, we can recover if we own that mistake, and then try and show that like we are here still to learn and kind of keep going. But I think I wanted to share the council has been a really powerful thing for us, is like one kind of operationalizing entity that's been important in this sort of conversation on continuing to learn more about DEI words and terminology across the globe.
Yeah, just to add a bit to what Jeremy has said, I think that this issue of terminology, or maybe understanding the categories of diversity and difference, is one of the big challenges for international education coming from the US, because so much of it has been based on US categories of diversity. And of course, diversity looks very different in different places in the world. And so I think part of this conversation that we're having as into our regions is that, yes, there are issues that overlap. There are similarities about racism, about discrimination around the world, but they take on this very different profile in different contexts. So for instance, we've been having discussions about what Black Lives Matter looks like in the Asia Pacific. And of course, it has a connection to this idea that racism exists around the world, but the way that it gets expressed, the way that people talk about it in these regions is very different. And so I see very much that part of our position is to kind of help mediate these conversations and also provide this historical and contextual context to what's really going on, and to get away from the idea that all sort of dealing with diversity has to be based on the US categories of diversity, because that isn't really the reality around the world. And part of that learning process for people coming into this is that, yes, their identities that they bring from the United States matter, but those identities are going to be recognized, received, and understood in different ways in the context in which they are coming into. And I think for the US side, for sort of the administrative side, that's part of a bit of a conversation that we're starting to have, with ECA, with the sort of administrative side of Fulbright, that they have to be more aware of what diversity looks like in different contexts, not just what diversity looks like on the US side, to fully support diverse students as they come into these places in which difference looks different.
And I think that's a great thing, because again, as an alumni ambassador, I always try to prepare people as much as possible. What we do over here in America can be vastly different in another country, right? And one of the things I enjoyed my time in Malaysia, but and my mentor and I grew really close throughout the year, but I knew, meeting her, I could tell, she was a little standoffish. And towards the end of the grant, she was like, when I first met you, I prayed to God, why did I get the Black ETA? But then as she got to know me and the work, and again, I am not the type to want to change anyone's mind, right? But as she got to know me, I was like, okay. And she shared, you're now my favorite ETA. So I think that can be challenging, but I think having those conversations with people in the other country as much as possible is definitely helpful. Going to our next question. How did COVID-19, and I think someone mentioned this earlier, how did COVID-19 allow your program to respond to the needs of constituents, institutions, and participants, or potential participants?
I can start. I think the big one that everyone's kind of talking about is like switching to virtual and how that's affected accessibility. So it's been a real learning experience for, I think, everyone in the field for the most part to adapt to, should we offer virtual programs? What should those look like? Are they really more accessible? So is that really what students want? Because I think, some students, it might provide them an opportunity for learning cultural competency and, not having to pay the money for a plane ticket to get somewhere and, switching their cost of living. But for others, they might not have access to reliable internet, or, what is the time difference how is that gonna affect things? So that's been just like a real kind of challenge and requires a lot of trial and error, I think, for a lot of us, where we have had space to do that, which has been, I think, a real kind of positive outcome of COVID, where we've had the space to try new things and have been forced to try new things because we all kind of just got thrown for a loop and had to scramble to adapt and figure out what can we try. ISEP tried doing virtual internships. We tried doing virtual opportunities where students took classes. We've tried hybrid opportunities, but it's been a good kind of trial by fire sort of situation where we can learn from this, figure out what best meets students' needs, and then offer that going forward so that we can increase accessibility. So for me, that's been kind of the biggest and most, exciting and challenging thing to come out of COVID is like, how do we address the need for virtual? And then is it really, like, what's the best way to make it the most accessible and most conducive for learning as well? So like, we want to make sure that students are really having a positive experience and getting a lot out of virtual, which can sometimes be hard, especially when, it's a fully virtual format where they're doing a lot of different classes online and just being able to stay in tune to what's going on, stay motivated when you're not having that face-to-face interaction. And then also, how do we encourage conversations between students to learn from each other, from other cultures, and to learn from locals, even if they're not physically in the country with those students, with locals. So that's been, just an interesting thing. I think the internship opportunity is really nice because students get the opportunity to, have that for their resume, but they connect with like local folks from the company that they're working for, from the organization. They get to really learn some professional development skills. So that's been pretty popular for us. And I think the hybrid options have also been really successful. So yeah, hearing those success stories about students that have done like service learning opportunities online through ISEP. We did that in Barcelona, for instance, and we had a lot of students participate in that program where they just volunteered for different organizations in Barcelona. It was facilitated by our resident director there virtually. And she offered like a kind of a class along with that for them to kind of reflect on the different experiences that they were having, gain some context for the culture there, for the work that they were doing. I think that's been really successful. And hearing the students talk about how, happy they were to get that experience. Maybe they're graduating, for instance, which has been really kind of heartbreaking to hear the students that really wanted to go abroad during their undergraduate or during their graduate programs, and they were planning to do it, and they had one semester to get it done. And that semester was when COVID hit and they couldn't go. And just hearing success stories where they were able to do something virtually has been really rewarding. But then also, you've heard some students who they don't want to have that virtual experience. And so finding opportunities for them to do maybe a hybrid situation. But yeah, some students just didn't get to do their dream experience. And that was really hard to hear because of their graduation or whatever. So yeah, there's been successes. There's been some, sad situations with students, but I think virtual has been the main response that has been kind of the trickiest to navigate, but also rewarding because students still got that cultural experience.
Okay. And we're down to our very last question. I'm so sad because I love the conversation. So in your efforts to increase DEI, what voices have you included to the discussion? How have their voices contributed to your programming? And I think we kind of hit on that a little bit earlier, but Jeremy and Kelly.
I'm happy to jump in here just to say a little bit about the COVID situation as well. So one of the programs that we put into play, in our first year in these positions, Jeremy and I, was that we were realizing how much the COVID-19 pandemic was really laying bare the kind of inequalities and inequities that we see in society, making them very obvious. And so we organized this 3-part webinar to try and just hear the voices and stories of people who have been affected by COVID-19, not just because of the pandemic, but what they have been living before the pandemic and how the COVID-19 pandemic has really increased the challenges that they face. So we worked together to have these global panels from people from our region that were either alumni or current Fulbright participants, or were working in nonprofit organizations or non-governmental organizations in our regions to really represent a lot of different voices. So we organized the 3 panels on the basis of identity. So we had one panel for minoritized and marginalized people talking about the effect of COVID-19 from across the world and their perspective. We had one panel on feminism and disability from people speaking from around the world from their perspective, and a final panel on people of Indigenous identity from around the world. And I think this was really a great opportunity to recognize that these things are not just because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but happening all the time. COVID-19 has just laid bare some of those inequalities and inequities, especially when it comes to access to education and access to their voices in public. And I think that we're trying through this conversation to get Fulbrighters and non-Fulbrighters involved in talking about how, the COVID-19 pandemic has something to teach us about all these inequalities that we're not seeing on a day-to-day basis, but now are being made more obvious because of, lack of access, because of intranet and all of these things that we've been discussing previously. So working, across different regions, working with alumni and also working with local organizations is really important, because there are people, I think, in our communities that Fulbrighters are working with and connecting with that don't have the access to being a Fulbrighter. And we want to make sure that their voices and their stories are represented as well. And so I think this focus on working with the communities in the regions where we inhabit and have grants and have programs is really an important part of sort of amplifying these stories and amplifying those voices.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think what I want to add. Well, I guess actually going back to one thing too, I think one of the things that I've been one of the things that Kelly and I did when we started these positions, because we started them last summer, also of course we started these jobs during COVID, was we did these sort of listening tours where we went and we basically just went to each of our commissions and posts, so the embassy, for posts referring to the embassies that run a Fulbright program in a country where there's not a commission, and just ask them questions about DEI, like what has the conversation been on diversity, equity, inclusion? And that was actually really helpful, because I think for both of us, it kind of informed us to what is being talked about, but I think more importantly to this question, what's not being talked about, or what support actually could we provide to help that conversation happen, right? Because I think sometimes it may be that the conversation is happening with some staff and not others. And so how do you bring everyone together in a certain way to do that? So, I mean, in my specific region, for example, actually this past week on Thursday, we ran a panel called Navigating Blackness in the Western Hemisphere. So we featured alumni that were from the US program, as well as the program of grantees coming to the US, with the moderator, who together just sort of spoke about together each panelist identified as Black and or Afro-descendant, and the themes were all about just navigating, moving through the Western Hemisphere as a Black or Afro-descendant person, understanding, the realities of anti-Black racism and colorism. And I think that was a really important panel to do, just to feature those voices. And I think it was also great too, because it was a way where we also would include Fulbright Noir to sort of speak at the beginning and share more about the affinity group and all they're doing. And just a quick brief, appreciation for the affinity groups. I think for Kelly and I, our positions probably would not be here without the advocacy and activism of the affinity groups, period. And so I think for us, that's really been a lot of it. It's been a lot of critical listening, identifying what are some of the areas or themes that have not necessarily been spoken to yet. How do we amplify the voices of folks who identify with those themes and with those identities to be able to have the conversation? And we're also where we need to step back, right? So as an example, I was not moderator for this panel, Navigating Blackness. As a white man, I saw my place as being, this is not my conversation to have. It's my place to try and do what I can with the resources I have to amplify it. So I think utilizing those sort of critical listening, back to what Kelly brought up earlier about the critical self-reflection on who we are, what are the spaces we are part of versus what are the spaces we're trying to also support and construct to be, I think are also really important and connected conversations in this piece. And I think just continue to do the work. COVID obviously has changed a lot, but we've been able to still connect. And I think as long as we're allowing ourselves to recover after 2 to 7 to 12 hours of Zoom a day, we can keep finding ways to do sort of these global connections via the technologies that we're now utilizing in ways that we were able to before, but because of circumstances, obviously we've learned to do even more with. So that's, I think, just what I wanted to say on this particular question. So a little bit back to the COVID piece.
Yeah, I agree with Jeremy and Kelly, and that was one of the first thoughts I had when you posed this question, is that kind of this rise of comfort with virtual events, and now it's people, I think before when you had a virtual panel or a virtual conference, it wasn't seen as it wasn't the only space people could connect, right? And people choose in-person connections, I think, over virtual. But now that this is where we all are, we're all used to it, we're all comfortable with the technology, been able to incorporate more voices. We've been able to have more meetings with people that we wouldn't normally have the opportunity to bring together. This We Represent conference itself is a great example of alumni being able to band together and get an audience on this platform to talk about these topics. And we use those voices. So like the first We Represent conference that was a couple of months ago, we had staff members attending all of the alumni panels on, the BIPOC experience of students abroad. Even if they weren't our alumni, we want to know what those experiences are like and learn from anybody who is willing to put their experience out there. So we definitely try to put ourselves in listening mode in that way as much as possible. And then we are also, like Fulbright, very fortunate to we have far fewer alumni than programs like Fulbright and Gilman. We're just a smaller program, but that does not make them any less mighty and any less well-informed and active in that community. So we have an alumni society that really has been lobbying for more transparency in what we're doing as a program on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's been a great opportunity for us to welcome them even further into that conversation, because we may have been like watching and listening before and using information from alumni surveys and alumni feedback to feed into kind of that cycle of improving what we're doing year over year. But now it's more of a direct two-way conversation. So using alumni voices, really critical. We listen to the voices of everyone on our team. Like I mentioned, those diversity, equity, and inclusion meetings that the CLS team and American Councils has monthly. They are not just for like managers on the team, they are for everybody to come and speak openly about their ideas and their experience. And then our international partners, listening to them, listening to the experiences that they observe, and then our selection panelists. So we work with advisors at institutions around the United States, because in that recruitment and outreach process, trust is such a big part of that we work really closely with our advisors to listen to what's happening on their campuses and what resources they need for their students. And then also to serve as our selection panelists, so that those that are reading the applications and doing the selection process are representative of the types of students that we want on the program. And we solicit their feedback on the rubric, on their students' experiences. So there are a lot of voices at play there. It's really important, I think, to diversify and broaden the voices that you're bringing into these conversations as much as possible, because it is not a singular topic. And there are so many identities and so much intersectionality that really everybody has something different to add to that conversation. And it is important to open it to many, many voices.
So the only thing I guess I have to add to this question that hasn't already been mentioned, it's just that I think it's important to have the discussion in as many places as possible. So like, for instance, not just in person anymore, but we've been doing stuff like Instagram takeovers and Instagram lives, where we're trying to meet students where they're at in terms of they're on social media. So sharing stories from students from diverse perspectives through Instagram has been really successful for us. For instance, and having students that are, maybe on a campus abroad, doing a takeover where they show us the campus, talk about the, maybe the buddy program that's available to kind of help students understand that they're going to be connected with a local student, what that looks like, how classes look, information like that, and sharing about their own, personal experiences as, maybe a student of color on campus, or, all different students with a disability, things like that, and just sharing that over social media, or doing an alumni panel, which we've done in the past. We have ISEP Voices bloggers where they write about their experience, or do our podcast. Just trying to, like I said, meet students where they are in order to, contribute to the discussion over multiple different platforms, or in person, or wherever they are, just like trying to find those best locations to share alumni voices, or just sharing students' voices so that they're definitely heard by other students. So that's the only thing I'll add on to the conversation there.
Well, thank you all so much for, again, sharing about your respective organizations and programs and what they're doing to really increase DEI. And this is the end of this panel. For those who are in the audience, we are now taking a break, and so networking is open. Thank you.